everyone. My name is Michael Rosin. I guess you could say I'm the local music historian as much as the town needs a music historian. Believe it or not, it's not a part of the essential services like grocery stores and fire departments, doctors, police stations. But I have been for about 5 years now the music historian at the local orchestra, New Jersey Festival Orchestra, formerly known as the Westfield Symphony Orchestra. I have directed or either played in music programs at many churches in town. I think I've played practically every public keyboard instrument from organs to harpsichords in town. I teach all levels of piano, music theory, and flute. I have students, plenty of students much older than me, adult students and younger students, both individual lessons and group lessons. Now it's entirely online, which has been going very well. So I offer these courses both in-person presentations and on lecture classes like this. So I'm here on behalf of the Westfield Historical Society. I am very happy to be sharing at least a little bit of what was supposed to be a long, hour-long Sunday afternoon presentation on April 5th, I believe, like they typically have guest speakers and presentations, but it was canceled, of course, due to COVID-19. So for this, I'm giving it more of a general overview of what I was going to speak about in a shorter time frame, and to kind of give enough to get ready for one day when we do return to a longer presentation, and especially to celebrate things like the Westfield 300 and both music history on the local level, both local level and the greater national level and global level. The first thing I want you to think about is putting those two words together, music and history, and how specific or general the history of music can be. For the most part, music is esoteric, but especially elusive. You know, when we think about themes in plays or in movies and the development over the course of time, and plays that were meant for comedic relief or drama, like Shakespeare plays, and then now movies that speak to Americans that are American movies, or movies that are about World War II, or a character that has a certain character flaw, or like a hero with a tragic flaw, and the mom in this movie and the dad in that movie, and the person who, you know, is full of passion and who's driven, and then someone who's just a simpleton, and trends of that, you know, we can put those in terms. You see how we can like relate that there's a trend of movies now to show careers of people that have has-beens, you know, who are kind of the end of their life, end of their career, or who are kind of out of touch, rather than focusing on the, you know, an elite figure. Some dramas will now focus on, you know, people who are in poverty, and this was a movement that happened in opera. The musical equivalent is verissimo, if we look at from the 19th to the 20th century, late 19th century. But those are all terms that relate to character and relate things. You know, we can label this, we can label someone's psychology on film or in a book or a novel. You know, all these apply to novels as well, and plays, but it's tricky with music. Like, even the one musical example I brought up was opera. And opera is one of the most widespread appeal of the classical genre, the high art music genres. But simply because it is, I believe, a part of theater, and there's storytelling and there's drama we can relate to, characters on stage who are going through things that we're going through things, and then when someone slaps someone, we can react to that. When the music, absolute music, that's a term, I'll explain it a bit, I'll come back to that. Like, where you're just listening to pure music, we can't say, oh, this, you hear that? That first violin's jealous of the trumpet player. You know, so that's what I mean by esoteric and elusive. And to link it back, that's what I mean about what's problematic about labeling music history, because trends are all sound. It's literally a history of sound and a history of harmony, and trends within music that I guess are objective, but how we view them is all subjective, especially when there's a double forte or something that's written like that's loud. That doesn't necessarily have to mean anchored. It's so much interpretation is what is needed in music, more so than specific. I think of other art forms like ballet or dancing. When you choreograph something, you can generally see a lead I mean, you can see elite, but you can generally see interactions between if they like each other, or if they're, they pair off and have their duet dancing, in a Tchaikovsky ballet, let's say, or what is a more of a stately approach, the very famous Montague and Capulets, the Dance of the Knights, and Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet, setting a play through ballet. So no text, but we still have a visual. That is where that falls under music history, of course. Ballet and opera, these all do, but I think I need to sing for not the unsung, but speak for a genre that is wordless, literally wordless. Symphonies, piano sonatas, right? Things written for instruments that don't speak. No lyrics. Okay, what a term, what as Americans or our modern idiom would understand, it doesn't have lyrics. Speak for that, because sometimes it's hard and it has no voice, and the general understanding of classical music is having to approach something that has a story, like opera or ballet, or that has a name, the Emperor Piano Concerto, what he meant, the Revolutionary Etude, what those mean. So to go back to that term, let's think about something that's absolute. If it's absolute, it's pure. It's just this one entity, like gold. It's not a mix of things. In the sense of music, forms that are don't bring in other elements that aren't extra musical meaning outside of music. So, for example, like I was saying, a piano sonata, a symphony, a prelude, it's just a piece, a piano sonata. Now, that's not to say there are piano sonatas and symphonies that truly have narratives and stories, and that's another lecture, that's for another day. There are plenty of examples. But I'm just going to say the origin of these terms and where they come from, the development of the string quartet, ternary form versus binary form. A binary form is like A and B, ternary form A, B, A. When you have in a 4-movement symphony, sometimes most likely the second movement, but traditionally, once the second movement was the slow movement, and the third movement would be a minuet and scherzo, while the first and last movement were the bigger movements, grander. One was in sonata, allegro form, one was in rondo. All this stuff that I'm saying right now, that's absolute music. You don't have to know those terms, but I'm just saying on absolute music terms. Great example of something that's totally a narrative. Film scores are meant to accent the drama on the scene. A composer who wants to write, I want this to be 5 minutes of the minuet, and then we go into a slower section, and then we're gonna go, it's whatever the movie says. He or she writes the music to what's on the screen, and underscores the drama. They have exactly 1 minute and 21 seconds to keep this pattern that's upbeat, and then it comes down. So that's music serving, being submissive to an image, to a drama. Opera has more freedom because it's not a direct click track, but you're writing music to a story. Same with a ballet, even with choreography. There's no words, but Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet, we're doing Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, there's some kind of story. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying submissive in a bad way. The story is on top in those senses, just like lyrics influence a song. But let's look at those two elements and see how that influences the history of music, absolute music versus extra musical narrative, and then extra musical narrative, opera, a film score, a ballet, also known as program music, the story. But I want to also make you think about those terms and challenge them in your own mind, or at least bring them to terms in American music, in what American music is. The main thing I was going to focus on for the Westfield Historical Society lecture that I will do someday, that was canceled back in April, was what is truly American music and identity for American music, and are things like those absolute music genres where I was saying minuet, symphony, piano sonata. Now we have Broadway musicals, we have songs with lyrics. Are those what are triumphant now? Do those live on? Is absolute music dead? Some forms of, at least the mainstream popularity of it, even in major classical pieces. Now pieces really, for the most part, have some sort of title or subtitle. Has the concept of absolute music, its original meaning, or the original forms of traditional music, have they died and gone away, or are they just evolved? Things like band music, and John Philip Sousa marches, which were the codified American sound of instrumental classical music that doesn't include jazz and Tin Pan Alley and, city Broadway. Not that sound, but the sound of American patriotism, or the sound of what we hear in the 4th of July, and that's John Philip Sousa marches, stuff written for the Marine Corps band. Is there narrative in that? Isn't that just an absolute form of patriotism and nationalism? When I say both those terms, I mean an identity of a country. And many countries have had this mission to codify what the sound of their nation is. And I think some poor composers, struggled with that most of their lives, and struggled from that pressure they put on themselves or was put upon them. To give an example, Ralph Vaughan Williams, the British Ralph, it looks like Ralph in American English composer from 1872 to 1958, I believe, who saw so much, started well into the 19th century and crossed well over into the 20th century. And for the most part, to leave it general for now, he had to reinvigorate an English sound, because up until that point, German music, Beethoven, Brahms, Bach, Wagner, all these names we know, Schumann, that Teutonic sound was dominant. It was really dominant for most of the Romantic era. And then French composers branch off and start doing their own thing. Debussy really started that movement. Even before that, Gabriel Fauré, and then Russian music also going in that area, but also Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov is a great example of someone who is like, I think, the Russian Fauré, and Fauré is the French version of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Were very preoccupied with codifying a sound for their nation, but being a traditionalist, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel in their sense. So that's an example of what I mean about national identity and patriotism. More just having your own an objective sound of England, or a sound of France, but you're also your own subjective, your thumbprint that comes through. Like, even we have, this piece sounds so French, this piece sounds so German, so English. Even every example of the stuff that sounds so German, so French, all of them still have a difference, because every composer is different, and every composer has a thumbprint. So maybe music, absolute and narrative, program music, can be more than simple entertainment and enjoyment. It does service that function, and even a space that's so powerful that changed the world, literally. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony comes to me as the blaring main example. It still is always enjoyment and entertainment, something we can put on and just sink in, right? Not like work. But this shows that there's some kind of greater voice. Does music really have that power for social, political, and cultural change? Can it change policies? Can it be used as propaganda? Like anything, I think the intention of music is beautiful, and how it's created, and just the glorious beauty of creation and human creation. Every sort of element that has infected that is because of a human error or because of human corruption. Music itself is absolute because it's completely unnecessary. Think of the years and think of how long it took back in the day, centuries ago, just to get food and prepare food and get shelter, community comforts that are just so expected now, and not for everyone, but I mean, this world is so different than it was. Recorded music and writing obviously didn't come around until well after humans had been on the planet for a long time, because it's not a necessity. People didn't have time to sit down and write music. They would create in a ritual ceremonial, but they've got to spend more time staying alive. So I think about that with developing nations and identity, in that, while head start, Germany and France and Italian music, this does apply to America, at least through the 1800s, because look at the history of American music. I mean, we established ourselves as a nation, the nation we know, the Judeo-Christian Anglo-Saxon nation in 1776. But when does American music come about? Well into the 1900s, well into the 20th century. what happened in the 1800s? There's a lot of part songs that came from that era, and a lot of there was American choral writers and hymn writers. It's a lot of Christian music, which was the same for 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, you know, music for the church. But that was still a developing nation that didn't have time to deal with something that was not an essential, that was not a part of the daily needs. And so when industry and technology comes about, that's when American music, as we know it, and I'm speaking mainly of the Anglo-Saxon white tradition, American classical music, because when we think of that today, we think of jazz and Tin Pan Alley, and the irony of all of that is the one American sound comes from that bluesy, jazzy sort of gospel, which is African American music. Just like American classical music, Aaron Copland, Leonard Bernstein, come from a European American tradition. There's always something else that comes, it's African American music or European American music, Cuban music, South American music, Central American music. It's the same for American classical music. You know, the development of classical music in traditional sense, writing symphonies and stuff. Those are all European forms. so is opera. So, and there's no offense to America. It's not its fault that it's just the natural course of time when the country was, throughout the 1800s, there were plantation songs and stuff that, wasn't necessarily notated. Scott Joplin and the Rags, rag piano, the entertainer, what we hear the Ice Cream Man play. That's to me, or, Little Liza Jane, or the old songs playing the banjo. Those are all different forms of American music. You would say the colonial development of colonial music, what became Southern music and jazz, what's now Southern music. So that the real voice of a nation is that are those little folk pockets, the sounds of the vox populi, the ones not in the mainstream, the ones not in charge of so much industry on, in the major metropolitan areas. And this is something that another composer I'd like to mention, Bela Bartok, a Hungarian composer, really walk the walk and talk the talk in this way. Trained classical composer, died in New York in 1945, concertos, symphonies, a lot of famous works. However, he went down and dirty to record primitive folk tunes, really go to the townspeople, Hungary, Romania, in that area, and what came, out of Ukrainian folk songs and Magyar songs, and those tunes of the people who have no voice, and he brought them voice, and he would record them on the already primitive recording tools of that time and notate it note for note in his music, and that became a staple. That was the sound. To me, that's a very powerful symbol of national identity. Stravinsky was like that and had that same affection towards honoring the folk music as it appears. But that's why when I say Bartok walks the walk and talks the talk, he really spent the time to go in and record, and actually record these poor folk people who knew exactly and actually sang it. They are the voice. And so that's what makes Bartok really the first quintessential ethnomusicologist, it's called. A musicologist is someone like an anyology, mixology, and the psychology or the knowledge of music and its history and theory and its in society. But ethnomusicology is the distinct focus on music from a certain nation or race, and really emphasizing the elements that make it different, or its elements that make it specifically that sound and specifically different. And so that's why Bartok, well-deserved, honorably wears that badge as one of the first grandfather ethnomusicology. Something to think about in relation to wanting to give a voice to those that don't have one, the unsung. That's identity. That's patriotism in music history. For what Bartok did is a great example. Vaughan Williams, bringing out the sounds of English Renaissance music. Centuries have passed since England had a fighting chance of developing a voice. And so honoring the old church music, the hymns in a postmodern society, or even into modernism, which Vaughan Williams was well into, still honoring a pastime that has nothing to do with his faith and what he believed, but just honoring the history of it. Just like you can walk into a church and look at it, how majestic and beautiful it is, but not be a Christian, not be a believer, still honoring it for its art and history. The opera, the movement of the opera movement, the Verissimo, singing the woes of the working class, unemployed philosopher, a poet. I'm thinking of La Boheme, his greatest hit, Puccini, for the #1 Verissimo opera composer. And so now when I think of Americanism, American music, to me, Leonard Bernstein is the iconic example because of so many elements, but he was the New York conductor of the New York Philharmonic who wrote musicals and started the young people's concerts and talked to kids and children, who moved in the highest circles of art music, rubbed shoulders with celebrities in both pop entertainment celebrities, performers, and classical music, still brought himself down to that level and still had a greater mission as an artist because he wanted to teach and express and learn and teach the generation, whether that's the poor working class or just the young ones who have no voice yet, to show them and go down on their level. Another composer, when I think codifying the American sound, a Czech composer, Dvorak, very famously came here. His American Quartet, the New World Symphony, from the New World Symphony is the full title of that piece. And I promise you'll recognize at least 2 themes from that symphony. It's very famous. And what he's emphasizing are these elements of the American sound, which were Native American and Afro-American spirituals. He died in 1904, so we're looking at being moved in the late 1800s to America. And so when we look at a developing nation, America was starting out, and in the 1800s, for 100 years without a voice that we know that's written in our, American jazz, sound of American jazz or country music. It comes first from the people who have no voice. The African Americans in the cotton fields, Native Americans, the voice that influenced that Dvorak included in his New World Symphony. Now, this is how you look at music that can having some kind of societal or cultural impact. There's your answer right there. The voice of a nation becomes the working class. Just like Bartok recorded those Hungarian folk tunes by the working class, or those that are living on a land for long enough to know the spirit of it. That, to me, is the great divider between absolute, or more like what absolves the line that separates absolute music and program music is this. Because that's the heart. In both of them there's that heart, and this heart of the propulsion behind music and why we create music, why we create something that affects us so much, but is absolutely not a need. There is no necessity about it. And like I said, it's realizing its powerlessness and where it's powerless that you can see where it's powerful, and this is where it's powerful. Their sound, their identity, their personality, both their thumbprint and the national identity that comes with that. That is so important. And Dvorak and Bartok, who take the music in Vaughan Williams from a past, a voice of people that would never make it into some work, and bring it out. That is music history for me. That's the history of music. It's stories of the origins and the behind the scenes of sound of music. What's the propulsion behind it? And that very local identity. Mahler literally trying to write the world, the symphony as the world, as he would say, capturing views and trying to capture the whole beauty of the world in one symphony, which seems like ridiculous, and literally trying to put all the influences. He had guitars in his 7th symphony, just combining. And you, on this macro level, you engross everything in it, but the micro, it's the voice of a small, damaged man who had such a conflict of identity and dualisms, even on that great macro level of what he tries to include in these hour-long symphonies, and this huge, powerful passion of the world, the symphony as the world, influences of all over, form and opera and text. It's still just the voice of one man who puts his troubles in his music, the turmoil in his marriage, the love of his children, the secluded man, the family man, the Jew, the Christian,
the man who was so passionate about his nation and culture, and yet so ready and eager to experiment with modernism. That, to me, is the history of music. When you're looking at the subjective and the objective elements of a composer and putting it together, program music and absolute, it's absolved. For me, the best presentations and the best classes were the ones where I always left with more questions. I usually ask a lot of questions. I'm always curious and stuff, so maybe that's just me, where it was very easy to get me to ask questions if you just present some information. But that's what I hope that this has given you today, and that there is some curious seed or spark in you now that makes you think about things where you weren't normally, where you wouldn't have considered in music otherwise. And especially now thinking about music in a way that, in all of its elements from the past, that how it's happened and how it's come about, like I was saying, from music and stories, or just music for listening, just notes on a piano, playing a simple piece with no name, a prelude, or something that's the score, the title score of a movie, or an opera, or a ballet, singing songs in musicals, and how those are very much programmed, telling a story. But what gives us the chills and the power is the music from that. So that in itself is an absolute element. Why the combination of sounds, concord of sweet harmonies, as Shakespeare put it in his description of music. What in that moves us, I'll never be able to answer. No one, I don't think anyone can answer. As much as we know, as much as we analyze, and as much information as we're given, why music does to us and our brain, and why we focus so much on making it. Among many of the arts, which are not needs, but music in particular, because like I said, it's elusive and esoteric. It just gives us this immediate response. And yet there's so many different ways to achieve that. And what someone finds deeply moving won't even make someone, blink, or they can't even stay awake listening to it. Those differences and preferences, I don't know how we could ever describe that or ever find that out. That lies in our personal identity, our identity of what we want to associate with and what we have associated with, where we've come from. And it's hugely important for the history of music to preserve that and understand and record and recall those times when national identity was huge and was something that was very important to codify and to be as much of your identity as your name was, as your birth date. So, because that's how we can trace back to where these certain things have come from, to where we can see the unsung voices, to find out where their voices came from, to record them out in the fields. That's how we trace this back, and that's why music history is so important, and musicology. I thank you all so much for listening. I hope that this was worth your time, and that it makes you chew over it, makes you want to think about it a little bit longer and be interested. I want to thank the Westfield Historical Society for hosting me and for inviting me to do this. If you like what you heard and you want to hear more, learn more about music, or to find out more about courses or sign up for lessons, visit my website, www.michaelrosin.com. I produce blogs and videos and posts and podcasts regularly about music and music history and music theory. I'm very active with it on social media, on Facebook, also on my WordPress blog and Coffee blog. But for those who really want to dive deeper, I do have a Patreon page where you can subscribe, and these are all on the homepage of my website. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope this is just part one of further series of talks that will happen in person someday, and both in Westfield and on the local level and on the greater national and global level. Thanks again, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.